Nazila Maroufian is a 23-year-old Kurdish journalist, and she was based in Tehran. And she was arrested by security forces on October 30th, just after she had published an article with the interviewing her interview with Mahsa Amini's father. She was then held in Evin prison, the notorious prison, before she was transferred, and she was sentenced to 2 years in prison, as well as a fine and a 5-year ban on leaving the country. Now, she was actually released on 9th of January on bail, but then she was rearrested on 8th of July after she was summoned. It's unclear why, but she was known to have been still very public on her social media accounts. She was then transferred while she was in detention because of a worsening medical condition, including where she reported suffering from shortness of breath. We saw then on August the 6th that the authorities had charged her with propaganda against the state. And finally, on August 13th, she was released from Evin prison with a fine of 300 million tomans on bail. Now, Nazila's release is really important, but she should never have been arrested in the first place. Her charge, particularly against her in her initial arrest, was relating to her journalistic work, and she should not have been facing punishment for it.
Yeah. It's quite interesting just at this juncture to try and understand why she was released. Do you think it may have been her health scare, or do you think there are bigger factors at play at the moment as the US and Iran sort of have resumed talks?
It's unclear. It might well have been to do with her medical condition. But we've seen this happen before. So in February, the Iranian authorities announced a broad amnesty where they released many of those who were detained with pardons or reduced sentences. But then in June and July, they began summoning and arresting a lot of people that they had released, including Nazila. And it was unclear why they were sort of arresting them at that point. It seemed that they were yet another crackdown. What we've seen happen, with just a month, we've got a month to go now before it's the first anniversary of Mahsa's death in custody. And in this year, we've seen the authorities crack down on the nationwide protests with excessive and lethal force. They've killed hundreds of protesters. They've imprisoned tens of thousands of them, as well as hundreds of activists and journalists and human rights defenders. And when we see even the releases, some of these releases and some of these arrests have not anything to do with these protests about Mahsa Amini or the mandatory hijab. They're sometimes released about issues around corruption, around conservationism. So the recent release of the US-Iranian national Morad Tahbaz, he is a businessman and wildlife conservationist who was actually arrested during a crackdown on environmental activists in January 2018.
What do you think? I mean, she's not the only one. Nazila's not the only woman to be detained, a female journalist. What do you think it tells us about women's rights in Iran or the targeting of women in Iran?
Well, there's a deep level of discrimination against women in Iran in both law and practice. They have the mandatory hijab that they're forced to comply, which means that they can't even leave the home without being denied their choice of dress, which impacts their whole freedom of movement. But there's all sorts of other laws and policies that discriminate against women. And we've seen a real worsening of women's rights over the last few years. In addition, the authorities really crack down on women who fight this, who try to demand their rights, including women journalists. So in Nazila's case, it's not just Nazila who was arrested because of her journalistic activity around Mahsa's death, but there are two other journalists, women journalists, who actually broke the story of her death and her funeral, and they're still in Evin prison and still facing charges. So we do see a serious, harsh crackdown from the authorities. And in recent months, we're really seeing the authorities becoming even more repressive again on the mandatory hijab. They're really trying to conserve their efforts and going back into repressing the idea that anyone might be defying the dress code. There's lots of women right now who maybe not going to protest, but they're just walking out of their homes without the hijab as a way of defying it. And the authorities are now cracking down on that through lots of myriad ways, looking at surveillance, looking at businesses, finding ways to punish women for having tried to defy the authorities.
But in fact, Nazila, when she was released, posted immediately on X without the mandatory headwear.
That's right. And it could be that she finds herself subject again to arrest. This is women are still finding ways to defy this, and yet the authorities are also going out of their ways to really try to punish it. It may have been that her second arrest, the one that she had recently been released, might have been to do with the fact that she had been on social media without a hijab. The authorities are trying to make it clear that they will not tolerate this. It's the idea of, we've seen them talk about surveillance of women on social media. So if you're a civil servant, you could get punished by being fired from your jobs. There's a new draft bill in Parliament right now that's being discussed that's going to allow for these new legal enforcement to take place. They're also trying to get businesses, they might close businesses if they allow women without the hijab in their spaces. So if you're a cinema or an event space and a woman is there not wearing the hijab, that business could face closure. So they're trying to find ways to get society at large to enforce a mandatory dress code, because they're seeing the fact that women are defying it in so many different spaces and everywhere.
Yeah.
And so this is which is very concerted action to try to break it all over again.
So do you think, in the US sort of restarting these talks with Iran and talk about freeing up aid and sanctions potentially, do you think that this needs to be a condition of these conversations?
Well, the US and the international community, particularly Iran's allies, really need to press on the Iranian authorities to end this repression. That means they need to release all people who have been held for the peaceful exercise of their expression of their freedoms, including freedom of expression or association or assembly, but also to quash any sentences. There's a lot of people who are on charges that could lead to the death penalty, and to also investigate the allegations of torture and ill treatment that we've heard countless times during detention, as well as the excessive use of force and the killings that have taken place in protests. These are huge numbers of violations of human rights, and it's really important that the international community steps up.
Really appreciate your time, as always, Rothna. Thank you very much.
Thank you.